April 14th, 1865. The President of the United States sits in Ford's Theatre, unaware that history is about to take a darker turn. Officially, John Wilkes Booth pulls the trigger. A lone gunman, driven by Southern rage. Case closed, right? But what if Booth wasn't alone? What if the bullet that ended Abraham Lincoln's life was fired at the command of men far more powerful than any Confederate spy? Men who never appeared in court, men whose names never made the headlines, men who controlled empires not with guns, but with gold. The theory is that Lincoln didn't just fight the Confederacy, he defied the most powerful bankers in the world. And for that, he may have been marked for death. Right now, we will peel back 150 years of history to ask the question no one dares. Did the world's most powerful banking dynasty conspire to assassinate Abraham Lincoln? When the Civil War erupted, financing the Union's survival was no easy task. Financing them is expensive, so banks would leverage their need and charge interest rates as high as 36%. Lincoln refused to bow to the money powers. Instead, he issued $450 million in government-backed paper currency called the Greenbacks. Genius. These notes bypassed bankers, provided debt-free money for the war effort, and then set a dangerous precedent in the eyes of international financiers. If a government could create its own money, what use were the banks? Money printed by the government, not borrowed from bankers, and no loans to pay with interest. Wow, what a ridiculous concept. Lincoln had found a way to fund his war bypassing the bankers. Lincoln's trusted advisor, Colonel Dick Taylor of Illinois, was tasked in researching alternative ways the Union could provide funding. Taylor reported back what he found and claimed that the Union did have the power under the Constitution to solve its financing problems by printing its money as a sovereign government. Taylor proclaimed, "Just get Congress to pass a bill authorizing the printing of full legal tender treasury notes and pay your soldiers with them and go ahead and win your war with them also. If you make them full legal tender, they will have the full sanction of the government and be just as good as any money." As Congress is given that express right by the Constitution, for the first time, America had a currency independent of private financiers. Soldiers were paid, suppliers equipped, and the Union survived. Lincoln had saved the Union's finances, but in doing so, Lincoln may have signed his own death warrant. Because across the Atlantic, powerful men began to whisper, "This cannot be allowed to stand." As for the European financial houses across the pond, one chief dissenter among them was the Rothschild's banking powerhouse. They saw Lincoln's policy as heresy and dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Oh yeah, that's right. Only dangerous to the bankers, not sovereign nations. But wait, remember President Andrew Jackson, who served from 1829 to 1837, was the only president to pay off the national debt in 1835, even with the constant threat from banking institutions to create a centralized bank in the US. Jackson was a fervent defender of this, and his widespread distrust of bankers was paramount. He did not want them to assume power of the US's financial system. Although he succeeded, it was short-lived. Tension was building with European bankers. European bankers led by the House of Rothschild saw Lincoln's Greenbacks as a dangerous precedent. A government that printed its own money, free of interest, threatened their very business model to indefinitely control the money supply. And that's why Lincoln's Greenbacks weren't just currency, they were revolutionary. And with revolutions, you make enemies. Lincoln wasn't just fighting a civil war, he was fighting the oldest war of all, the battle over who controls money. But you already know how the story goes. Eventually, over time, power and greed prevails. US later gave in when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Banking Act in 1913, which established a banking agency called the Federal Reserve System. And if you do not know, the Federal Reserve Banks are not government agencies. The Federal Reserve is designed to be an independent agency. While the Board of Governors is part of the federal government, but the Federal Reserve System is self-funded and not part of the Congressional Appropriations Committee. Interesting. With that said, the bankers may have had the motive, but who had the gun? And so, here enters John Wilkes Booth. The infamous John Wilkes Booth. Actor, Confederate sympathizer, and assassin. Booth hated Lincoln with a burning fury. He called him a tyrant, a destroyer of liberty. He plotted first to kidnap the president, then, as the South collapsed, to kill him. After a 12-day manhunt, Booth was shot and captured in a Virginia barn by Union soldiers on April 26, 1865. Booth's belongings were searched. Investigators found a cipher code linking him directly to the Confederate Secret Service. Also in Richmond, Virginia, an identical cipher was discovered in the office of Confederate Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, the so-called brains of the rebellion. This proved Booth was in contact with Richmond, but Booth had also traveled to Montreal, a known hub of Confederate and European agents with connections across the ocean to London and Paris, where the bankers waited. So did he receive more than encouragement? Did he receive money and orders? Maybe. There is little to no evidence on this, but from what was gathered, we do know. Booth's plot wasn't random. He was tied to Confederate intelligence, leading the belief that those ties stretched much further. By 1863, things were ramping up. The machinery of war was powered not only by soldiers, but by financiers. With the passage of the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, the US government chartered new national banks, requiring them to hold US bonds as reserves. This gave bankers immense leverage in the wartime economy. One prominent figure who benefited was Jay Cooke, the banker who almost single-handedly raised hundreds of millions for the Union through aggressive bond drives. With every bond sold, Cooke's power grew, and so did that of the financiers who underwrote America's survival. Then there was August Belmont, a German-born financier with close ties to the House of Rothschild. Publicly, Belmont backed the Union cause, lobbying in Europe for recognition of Lincoln's government. Privately, he was linked to transactions in Southern bonds. Belmont's double role, patriot and speculator, makes him a shadowy figure in this financial drama. And across the Atlantic, the French banking house Emile Erlanger and Company orchestrated the Confederacy's 1863 Erlanger loan, collateralized by cotton. The loan was oversubscribed in London and Paris, showing that European capital was willing to gamble on the South. For conspiracy theorists, the Rothschilds' reach through networks of bankers and agents made them more than bystanders. So, why would such financiers want Lincoln gone? Because his greenbacks undermined their leverage, his protectionist tariffs threatened their free trade empires, and his lenient plan for Reconstruction promised to flood the markets with cotton, collapsing prices, and crushing their speculative bets. To those with fortunes at stake, Lincoln's death could mean financial salvation. And if Lincoln's bold monetary revolution threatened those interests, his death could have been more than coincidence. It could have been calculated. The official story ties the plot to Confederate diehards, but when Booth's diary is found with pages missing, when the Secretary of War himself is accused of hiding evidence, we're left with skepticism and questions. Questions that refuse to stay buried. The trial of Booth's accomplices gave America closure. Those who were involved were Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Herold, who were all tried and found guilty for their parts in the conspiracy. Their roles ranged from providing refuge for Booth to the violent assault on Secretary of State William Seward and the failed attempt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. While Booth himself fired the fatal shot at Lincoln, these accomplices were sentenced to death and hanged on July 7th, 1865. But in the shadows, troubling details refused to vanish. When Booth was killed, soldiers found a small diary on his body. Inside were angry ramblings, but also gaps. At least 18 pages were missing. Who tore them out? And what did they say? Some whispered that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton himself kept them hidden, fearful they revealed names of northern financiers and politicians complicit in the plot. Stanton denied it. Yet decades later, those missing pages became the beating heart of every conspiracy theory. Union spy chief Lafayette C. Baker, who led the manhunt, had little love for Stanton. In his memoirs, he hinted that powerful men inside Lincoln's own administration suppressed evidence implicating that Stanton was withholding evidence. But Stanton denied any wrongdoing, because the diary changed hands several times before it was received by Lafayette. Baker was furious. He accused insiders of covering up a plot far larger than 8 conspirators, claiming that Booth was also part of a network far larger than the handful of conspirators who were previously hanged. But to no avail, the investigation halted after suspects were condemned, and the case was closed. Justice was served. Or was it? Was this bitterness from a spymaster sidelined, or an insider's warning about a buried truth? We will never know, and can only speculate. In the midst of the investigations, Confederate Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, remember him? He burned his records before fleeing to Britain. Known as the Confederacy's brains of the cabinet, Benjamin resurfaced in London, practicing law among Europe's elite. To skeptics, his vanishing act was no coincidence. Had he destroyed evidence tying Confederate funds, and perhaps Rothschild connections to Booth's mission? I think so. Why flee in a hurry and destroy papers of the incident and never look back? And then there's the money trail. Greenbacks had challenged the old order, threatening the profits of bankers at home and abroad. Lincoln's death conveniently cleared the way for a post-war system where Wall Street and European capital soon dominated. Was this simply the tide of history, or the fulfillment of a plot already in motion? These unanswered questions, the missing diary, the accusations, the burned papers, they refuse to die. And they leave us with a haunting thought. Did we ever uncover the full story of Abraham Lincoln's assassination? Or just the story we were meant to hear? But what do historians think? Historians have pushed back. They argue there's no evidence linking Rothschilds or any bankers to the murder. They dismiss it as fantasy. No evidence, no paper trail, no confession. But is that because the truth was never there, or because it was buried too well? The conspirators were tried. 4 were hanged. Booth was dead, and Booth's motives were Confederate loyalty and rage, not financial theory. Case closed. At the 1865 tribunal, witnesses tied Booth to Confederate spies in Montreal, but none mentioned bankers. Booth's own words railed against Lincoln as a tyrant, not as a foe of financiers. No letters, no payments, no confession. Without a smoking gun, the banker conspiracy remains speculation. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the questions never stopped. Later, in the 1970s, Lyndon LaRouche's movement revived the Rothschild angle, weaving Lincoln's death into a centuries-long plot of banking domination. And in modern times, conspiracy sites echo the claim. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy, all seem to be struck down for resisting the money power. Critics call it myth. Believers call it suppressed history. Either way, the story refuses to die. Booth fired the bullet, but whose hand steadied his aim? A zealot's or an empire's? So, officially, Lincoln fell to Booth and a band of Confederate diehards. But the conspiracy theory paints a darker picture, one where international bankers silenced a president who dared to defy them. The evidence? Circumstantial. The suspicion? Enduring. Although it is interesting how this sounds eerily similar to the JFK assassination, and yet till this day, many unanswered questions and the full files of the case still have not been released. Just saying. In the end, the truth lies somewhere between history and myth. Lincoln's death remains America's enduring riddle, a story of power, money, and tragedy. an American tragedy that still casts shadows on our tumultuous past. Thanks for sticking around and watching. Support the channel by hitting the like and subscribe button so I can continue my quest for Veritas. Until the next one, take care and remember, stay curious.